Hey everyone, E here. Today's video takes after a Facebook post I wrote yesterday, so if you already read that, then there's probably not going to be any new information here, but nonetheless, today I wanted to introduce some traditionalist ideas concerning regality, beyond the reductionist economic and material arguments for monarchic rule. As someone who has been heavily involved in libertarian circles, many people's first impression of monarchism and traditionalism is given to them by Hans Hermann Hoppe, who reduces the value of sovereignty to material forces and hence leaves those persuaded by it unmoved and unaware of the chaos of becoming, a concept we will elaborate on in a moment. And nonetheless, they are arrived at all sorts of confused positions, such as anarcho-monarchism, this being an effort to justify absolutism via liberal anthropology, and to make the ruler justified by that which is beneath him, that being the ruled, and all the while predicating their investigation of the world on the fraudulence of the pre-societal individual. So instead, I seek to introduce a way of thinking that provides intrinsicness to sovereignty, one that offers absolutism as an inevitable consequence of what divides man from pre-man. Hence, let's explore some basic concepts of traditional governance. Now, a lot of the discourse surrounding traditionalism and its diagnosis of modern civilization starts with splitting all of existence into two natures, that of the physical, mortal, and temporary, and that of the metaphysical, immortal, and eternal. Now, often the latter is known as the realm of being, and is seen as superior and the only referent for meaning and value, while the former is often known as the realm of becoming, the dimension of our existence that, although may be tangible, operational, and visible, is ultimately hollow until life is breathed into it by that which is divine, intangible, and again is referent to the realm of being. Now, a lot of traditionalist thought plays into this idea of modern man building his understanding of reality only through his experience of the physical world and the objects within it, a view often known as materialism. And furthermore, traditionalists seek to revolt from the Enlightenment project to drag knowledge down to the status of the handmaiden of earthly science. And often this idea of a realm of being is reached by what is called asceticism, this being the tradition of self-mastery and discipline and the living of a unified and universalized life. This is to say, living a life that is justified and not spent sought after other people or things. And these are of course some of the ideas I have talked about before on many of my other videos, but the heart of tradition relies often upon the notion of a world beyond this world. It is contingent on something spiritual and beyond our own earthly living. And so, in contrast to Aristotle and many of the modernist conservatives, libertarians, and capitalists of today's day and age, any facet of living is meaningless unless it can find some external reference point to that which is above ourselves, unless it can approximate the divine and furthermore serve as liberating from the human condition, it is ultimately worthless. To quote Julius Evola, quote, "According to tradition, every authority is fraudulent, every law is unjust and barbarous, every institution is vain and ephemeral, unless they are ordained to the superior principle of being, and unless they are derived from above and oriented upwards," end quote. And here we see Evola repeat this idea of scaling upwards and having an escalating trajectory, and of course government is no exception to this rule. So sovereignty is not justified by any deferral between the citizens and the sovereign vis-a-vis natural law, as this would assume there was some pre-societal individual that could erect the sovereign by some social contract. Now, generative anthropology has taught us that this is a lie, and that the very emergence of man from pre-man is one that is societal. And in many ways, it is the sovereign that makes us men and not beasts, or at least it is the consequence of that originary event. So in contrast to Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and others, this world of tradition is one where kings find their authority in the divine, in that which is above them, that which is transcendent, and not that which is below them. i.e. the citizenry. So to quote Evola yet again, quote, "The traditional world knew divine kingship. It knew the bridge between the two worlds, namely initiation. It knew the two great ways of approach to the transcendent, namely heroic action and contemplation, and it knew mediation, namely rights and faithfulness. It knew the social foundation, namely the traditional law and the caste system, and it knew the political earthly symbol, namely the empire. These are the foundations of the traditional hierarchy and civilization that have been completely wiped out by the victorious anthropocentric civilizations of our contemporaries." So again, in the traditional world, end quote. So again, in the traditional world, a law's authority could only be considered legitimate if it could be traced back to some non-human and transcendent source, in which then its authority would become absolute, inflexible, ineffable, immutable, and beyond criticism. In fact, the notion of a law existing for the sake of temporal life, without any reference or upscaling to that which is above our earthly social order, is a facet strictly of the modern world, that is, the world of anti-tradition. Furthermore, authors such as Franklin Merrill Wolfe see a reductionist element in this, as science finds its justification only in doing, when great philosophy is instead a way of realization. This dichotomy between realizing and merely doing is crucial to theorists like Wolfe, a dichotomy that states that the ultimate function of realization is to supply the knowledge of our being, and the function of our doing is first and foremost a means of understanding how we act. Naturally, this is secondary, as action is only valuable as it is instrumental to our being. Now, something interesting about Wolfe's and other esoteric thinkers' approach to philosophy is that they believe, contrary to the Enlightenment era, modern and subsequently postmodern schools of thought, that skepticism drawn to its full extent is a dead end. Now, this isn't to discourage or dissuade critical thought, but to say certainty is lost with even the hope that certainty may ever be found, which is to reject the quote-unquote gambler's world knowledge has found itself in, where the religious need for belief that man finds instilled within himself can only be satisfied with illusion, which goes back to the problem of induction and the lack of a clear way to achieve any strictly empirical knowledge that isn't only probable knowledge, or maybe a type of knowledge that serves not as anything true, but as a means of adaptation for an organism to its environment. So, according to people like Wolfe, there must be certainty if there is anything more to this world than darkness, and many other authors such as the extremely popular Jordan B. Peterson and others in the psychoanalyst tradition will adopt a position of pragmatism, where the utility of satisfying man's religious nature converges with its truthhood, and that an idea that offers archetypal value could also be said to be archetypal knowledge. But moving forward, the pathway to certainty requires more than mere criticism, and so because of this, the esoteric and traditionalist thinker seeks to find a source of knowledge beyond experience, as even if our inductive processes are perfectly sound, we experience the world as an infinite stream with no beginning and no end that, through science, we seek to systematize by cutting up this stream at arbitrary points, defining and organizing them with great skill and deliberation, and we see this world as physical objects that we can explain in reference to other physical objects, but eventually, this stream of reference will require using objects outside of what is visible, tangible, and experiential. And so, because of the endless nature of experience, the relation between these points are unknown. So, nonetheless, Wolfe and others take up the ancient tradition of constructing a third organ of knowledge outside reason and experience. And I suppose one of the first great thinkers in the firing line for people like Wolfe would be Immanuel Kant, who in his Critique of Pure Reason suggested that reason on its own was sufficient and necessary to establish judgments of possibility and affirm the existence of that possibility also. However, both this framework and the unification of it with the material given through the senses, that is, empiricism, to further incorporate an organized underlaw fail to satisfy a very real part of the human experience and greater demands within human consciousness. Now, Wolff recognizes that Kant both understood this and sought to solve such a problem in his critique of practical reason, but Wolff sees his efforts as futile. In fact, Wolff again asserts that for thought alone, there is no certain, but only probable knowledge. So this isn't to say that, according to Wolff, Kant was wrong to think conclusions about possible existence can be drawn from pure thought, but instead, that there is a third sphere of knowledge that is neither conceptual or empirical, but is instead transcendental. But nonetheless, let's return to this dichotomy between the physical and the metaphysical, and this notion that knowledge of the physical, if it is to be held with any degree of certainty, must have some external reference point to that in the metaphysical. Now, these ideas discussed so far were widely held in ancient times. For instance, in the Hindu and Buddhist tradition, the infinite stream of physical objects that make up our experiences that can be broken up at points and classified and operationalized, only to have any quote-unquote knowledge gained from the process dwindle away upon the realization that our explanations would tie back to things outside our experience, such as objects that exist at a quantum level or existed before humans ever came to be. This notion is greatly reflected by the idea of samsara, a current that carries away every form or structure of the physical or inferior world, a concept that also describes the blind, naive, and irrational identification with that which is mortal, temporary, and formless, while in addition, the Hellenistic period of Greece was a time where similar views of nature as being deprived of its principle, direction, and purpose were commonplace. But to continue, traditional authority is predicated on and feared because of a non-human quality instilled within the king, a quality that is transcendent and above politics. His authority was not a mere expression of those that he rules, nor was the strength, wisdom, courage, and other secular virtues the roots of his authority, but instead, traditional civilization and its rulers had a metaphysical character, one that could find reference to the infinite nature of the divine. The first historical example that comes to mind would be the Egyptian pharaoh, a monarch believed to be Ra embodied in human form, symbolizing the duality of man as a mortal god and God as an immortal man, while similarly, the Roman emperors were believed to be the manifestation of Zeus, and the Nordic Germanics that of Odin, the Assyrians of Baal, and again this is repeated throughout traditional society. Even one of the most universal cultural symbols by which the most sacred knowledge of regality was carried down includes, first and foremost, the throne, an elevated place symbolizing the nature of royal man. It was tradition for the king to sit still, elevated above the citizenry, and evoking the notion of the unmoved mover, or the deistic quality inside himself. So again, for reasons I've gone into elsewhere, regality and kingship is the natural order and needs no revolution, warfare, or physical strength to uphold. This isn't to say that the traditional world was without war, as war-making is after all the governing factor of the state's emergent nature, but it is to say that kingship asserts itself by the spirit. I've said before, there are men that see themselves as ascendant to others, and they will then inspire others with trust in themselves. Now, of course, the most desirable monopoly for elites and natural figures of authority is a monopoly on the judicial system, while also, as these monopolies are the result of these individuals' elitist characters and achievements, it makes sense for them to ascribe some sort of ownership over these monopolies. So thus, the most primordial states are monarchic and are ruled personally and privately. Now, this form of governance is also reflected by the Hindu notion of Sarvabhauma, a benevolent mode of governance enforced universally by a ruler referred to as Chakravartin, which translates to wheel spinner, reinforcing the idea of society being congregated around a center corresponding to a way of being. This notion of a center that the rest of society spirals and congregates around is repeated by the notion of samsara, the stream of becoming, also called the wheel of generation or the wheel of fate by the Hellenes. Now, the center of the wheel is seen as motionless and stable, a point immune from the stream of samsara that can organize itself in accordance with a higher principle and govern the objects in an inferior realm. Now, I have talked about this in my videos on generative anthropology, but I think it is worth returning to the subject briefly here. The Brussels Journal has a good entry on this entitled Eric L. Garns on Language, Culture, God, and the Market, where it writes on the mimetic crisis, that is the event spawning the cultural creature we see as man today, quote, "This is the crisis. It begins imitatively, perhaps through the group's convergence on an indivisible item of strong appetite of interest. One member of the pack moves to appropriate the item, and immediately all other members imitate his movement. As the pack converges on the object, and as everyone imitates everyone else's interest in it, conflict breaks out. The inciting item, Garrard argues, now becomes irrelevant, as every member of the pack finds himself in potentially lethal combat with every other member of the pack. The fighting itself having an imitative character, it swiftly intensifies. So how then does violence de-escalate itself? How does the pack survive? In any group, in any situation, there will be a weakest member or a first to falter. That faltering is, in the context itself, conspicuous, and the combats now begin to imitate the blows of the one who felled the falterer, concentrating their violence on the weakling," end quote. So again, as I have explained elsewhere, from this self-perpetuating violence emerges a new form of self-awareness, as man is pressured more and more by his witnessing of his own decline, and the mimetic nature of man leads him to fear conflict so much that not only does he abort this appropriative gesture in this event, but he appropriates the gesture to abort from others, which is contained within the first linguistic act. So subsequently, man is thus left with a designated object, but has aborted the gesture by which he appropriates it, leaving behind the longing for its possession. So again, everyone learns of one another's efforts to abort conflict over the object of desire, but not to suspend the desire for the object itself, and this is collectively mimicked until its completion in a formal matter, i.e. the first linguistic act. So, culture and the archetypes which comprise it is the deferral of violence through symbolism and representation, and in addition, this mimetic crisis and the originary moment embodies itself in every aspect of our culture today. To refer back to examples I've used before, the notions of equality before the law, for instance, repeats the first sign of a deferral of conflict and a greater solidarity over some abortive gesture. But of course, their current meanings can become lost and warped by the modern world. However, in traditional society, large masses of people congregated around a ruler, transforming them into a sacralized center, ultimately scaling the originary scene upwards in humanity's united subjection to the sovereign, just as the sovereign scales up to the transcendent. So, what have we learned today? There is a particular dynamic and understanding that the traditional man has. He sees that which is true, virtuous, good, and valuable as separate from the temporal, earthly, and most immediate existence he finds himself in. He sees this realm as that of being, and the inferior stream of chaos he seeks to separate himself from as that of becoming. While in addition, within this samsara, the traditional mode of governance finds a mortal god standing polar and motionless, intact with a higher principle that he can then bring down and with it liberate the masses that have congregated around him. There are many ways a traditionalist comes to this conclusion, whether through a more secular and pragmatist projection of liberal anthropology, or strictly through something metaphysical and spiritual. But either way, he acknowledges and attempts to satisfy man's religious yearning for absolutism. But guys, that's going to have to do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and remember, if you want to see my social media links, see the original post this came from, go check out the links in the description. See you guys later.